Who wrote this whole thing, and David Tafuri, a former foreign policy advisor for the Obama campaign and a former UN and State Department official. Gentlemen, good to have both of you on. And Gabe, this is your piece, but I want to quote Jen Palmieri, right, who was the comms chief under the Obama, the second go-round. They miss Dad and they're homesick, they being Americans. And there's so much in the world that's disorienting, and they want something that they love, and that's familiar, and he can never be what people ultimately want. What was your biggest takeaway?
Well, the biggest takeaway here was essentially that Barack Obama was always going to do something like this. When he left office, the idea was that he was always going to take a step back. He was not going to try and be some kind of shadow president, as a lot of people seem to want him to be. Basically, this is all about how he views change. Over the long run, he's not going to be the person who's jumping into our daily politics all the time and trying to fight President Trump.
You tell this story. One of Obama's friends tells you about how he was with him for like 45 minutes, and he totally avoided the subject of Trump. And I think at one point there was a TV on with the Chiron about Trump, and you know what it was.
Yeah.
And it was just like a blip. He just didn't want to go there.
That's right. So people that talk to President Obama these days say that he basically doesn't talk about Trump. It's not that he avoids it or that he's like trained himself not to talk about him, but that it's just not what he's interested in talking about. There's Valerie Jarrett, who's one of his closest advisors, is quoted in the story essentially saying, why would he waste his time talking about Donald Trump? He can't influence him. That much is clear. And, over and over, his people said to me when I was working on this, listen, if he were to get out there and start agitating, start saying, we need to fight against Trump on this and this and this, what would that do other than consolidate Republicans, behind Trump? A lot of these people that don't like Obama essentially would fall in line behind Trump, and that's not exactly what Democrats need right now. So,
David, here's my question to you. I was looking at what the political director over at ABC, Rick Klein, had said from his conversation with Ben Rhodes, that Obama has been, the quote is, letting other voices emerge, but is poised to hit the campaign trail this fall. And so, and we've been reporting on some of these meetings he's been having with potential 2020 candidates. I'm wondering, do you see this as how President Obama uses his voice the most?
Well, it's a great piece by Gabriel. His last line sums it up, because he says that Obama's absence is self-imposed. And this really goes back to what I think was one of the weaknesses of President Obama, which was his reluctance to engage. So in my area of expertise, foreign policy, we saw it where he was reluctant to engage in Syria, even though he promised that he would act if Assad crossed the red line. We now see it in his post-presidency, where he's unwilling to sort of engage in the fray, even at times of crisis, like we have with the separation of children issue, where I think people want to see him engage. So we have this promise that you mentioned that he's going to engage more in the midterm elections, but he's apparently going to wait until September to do that, and that really might be too late. But the other problem that this highlights has nothing to do with Obama. It's that the Democratic Party doesn't have a new standard bearer. They don't have someone who's a front runner for the 2020 presidential campaign, and they don't have someone who can really speak out on behalf of the party and describe the party's platform. So there's also a vacuum that people want President Obama to fill, but he's unwilling to fill.
But David, if he doesn't come out, and speak about the polarization, the norm bashing, is it going to be too little too late when he does?
I mean, we don't know the answer to that, but I think people who are worried that it's going to be too late have a reason to worry, because, as I mentioned, there's no one else who can really do it with the authority that President Obama can do it with. He's still pretty young, he's still very articulate, he's still very persuasive, and he had a pretty successful presidency, so he has a lot of power that he could wield, and if he doesn't do that, you're right, there may not be anyone else who can.
What's he up to now? I mean, you talk about Words with Friends games on his iPad. Like, seriously, what's he doing?
Well, he is actually preparing to play a big role in the midterms, and he is raising money. Some Democrats would like him to be doing a lot more of it, of course.
Yeah.
But the answer is yes, he's playing Words with Friends on his iPad, and he's golfing and traveling, but he's also building up a really ambitious foundation that is going to last for decades to come because, of course, he is a young guy. And he's writing a book. He's sitting down at his desk in Washington at his new office. He's writing it out longhand on yellow legal pads, sort of trying to get at it's a memoir. It's another memoir for him. So that's taking a lot of time. But the idea that he's just taken a step back and sort of said, I did my time, I don't want to deal with this anymore, that's not what this is. he sees the history as a long arc, and he does genuinely believe that this is just a blip that we're going through. He looks at the early years of his own presidency, and he really appreciates and often talks to this about this with friends, how George W. Bush treated him by not weighing in even when he disagreed. So it is true that President Trump is trying as hard as he can to go at Obama's legacy, but Obama's saying, listen, all of this is temporary. It's not right for our nation to have a former president fighting a current president. That's just not healthy for our democracy. And it's time for other leaders to step up. And some Democrats are starting to do it. It's true that there's not one standard bearer, and that's why they want him. But he's saying, time for you to try.
Gabe Debenedetti, it is your cover piece on New York Magazine. Thank you so much for coming in. And David Tafuri, thank you.